The Forgotten Village, buried under Central Park. The construction of Central Park began in 1858, but it wasn't tall wilderness before that. The area between West 82nd to West 89th Street was settled. In fact, it was home to a prosperous community. It was known as Seneca Village. 2/3 of its population was African American. Seneca Village had 255 residents. By 1855, the village was a refuge from racial discrimination. Its story began with John and Elizabeth Whitehead. The two landowners divided up their property. They sold it as separate lots to anyone with money. The first 3 plots were purchased by Andrew Williams. He was a 25-year-old African-American shoeshiner. Williams paid $125 for the plots. A store clerk named Epiphany Davis bought 12 more lots. He shelled out $578. As more citizens purchased lots, Seneca Village came into being. Half of the lot purchases were from African Americans. The residents raised livestock and cultivated gardens. By the early 1830s, 10 homes were established in Seneca. 20 years later, there were 50. This was in addition to 3 churches, schools, and a graveyard. In New York, slavery was abolished in 1827, but racial discrimination was still prevalent. Seneca Village was remote enough to allow privacy. It offered a safe haven for blacks who could afford it. Owning property was a big deal at the time. New York made it a prerequisite for the right to vote. An African American man had to own a minimum $250 worth of property. He also needed to have at least 3 years of residency. In 1845, there were 13,000 black New Yorkers. Only about 100 were qualified to vote that year. 10 of them lived in Seneca Village. Seneca offered an unusually high level of address stability. Nevertheless, many of the residents were still poor. They worked in construction, day labor, or food service. Only 3 residents could be considered middle class. 2 were grocers, and the other was an innkeeper. Many black women worked as domestic servants. Many residents boarded in homes they didn't own. So even within Seneca Village, class divisions were obvious. The residents grew their own food in gardens. They fished in the nearby Hudson River. They gathered firewood in nearby forests. Tanner's Spring supplied the village with fresh water. It wasn't until the early 1850s that Seneca Village became threatened. There was talk of creating a large municipal park. A few years later, 775 acres of land was allocated for the park. It would be America's first major landscaped park with public access. The city used eminent domain laws to seize the land. Owners were offered an average of $700 for their property. Andrew Williams was paid $2,335 for his house and 3 lots. Members of the community fought to retain their land. For 2 years, they protested and filed lawsuits to halt the project, but they lost, and all 1,500 residents were evicted. All the properties were razed in 1857. Only one institution from Seneca Village survived. It was All Angels Church, which relocated a couple of blocks away. The congregation, however, was entirely new. No one knows what happened to the original residents. Seneca Village was forgotten soon after it was gone.